Okay, so we now have Visual Studio open, and I have it open with just a blank solution. I'm gonna now create the first Blazor site. Basically, it's a WebAssembly site. So I'll just call it tutorial one. And we're not gonna need HTTPS, so get rid of that. It's not hosted in Core. You can make it a progressive web application if you so desire. In this case, I'm not gonna do that. Okay. So we have our first Blazor app, and we'll just run this to test it. Move this over here. Okay, there we go. And that's fully running. And now we're gonna create a second one. Same thing. And so this is going to link to our first Blazor site. It's going to link to our second Blazor site. And then we finally need a final one. So, and this is just our base, right? So we'll just call it tutorial. So this is where people will go to if no paths have been provided. So we'll just call this one tutorials. Same thing. All right. And then finally, we will go into this nav menu and we'll add an entry that takes us to the second one. This will take us to tutorial one. And then over here, take us to tutorial two. So basically what's happening here, we simply have, I'll run this again. Okay, so we simply have this fetch data, which takes me to tutorial two, which obviously doesn't exist, so nothing happens there. Okay. So we're gonna call this actually just call it tutorial two. And then over here, we'll call it tutorial one. Okay. And actually in here, we won't bother with this. Let's leave this alone. Just so we can see everything all working properly. We'll do this at the higher level. Okay. So now we're done with that. Right. Now, the next thing we have to do is we have to publish these to Azure. So we got to create some app services for each one of these. So you can do that by simply clicking publish, right? Then select Azure. Just give it a unique name. And we're gonna use this hosting plan. So here's the first tutorial. Okay, so we'll finish this up. Okay. And we're ready to publish. It's self-contained, portable, everything is good. So we're gonna publish that. Here is the tutorial 1 website. Okay, so now let's publish tutorial 2. So you see now that tutorial 1 shows up. So each app service that gets created could be could basically be plugged into where it needs to be, or you could create a new one. So we're gonna be creating a new one here. So use the same name. Make sure everything is the same. So resource group. Okay, so this one is done. And then we can publish it. It looks like this is also published. Here's tutorial 2 working. This is Blazor Web Assembly. So this is running locally on the browser. Let's go ahead and let's publish the third guy. Okay, so it looks like the site is up now and all 3 sites are up. So let's go ahead and let's get started with setting up the gateway. So to do this now, we will need Azure. Go over here, go into the portal. And majority of our work is going to be inside of one resource group, this network hub resource group. So let's go in here and we can see if I sort by just app service, we can see that my 3 app services are there now. Okay. And one of the things that we're going to need to do to get this thing going is we're going to need to disable the forced HTTPS on these. Right? And we need to disable this because basically we're going to be using application gateway and we need certificates. So in a real world scenario, you would not do this, but we don't actually have certs for the example that we're doing. So we're just gonna go work without it. So you wanna go to configuration and then go to general, and then you scroll down here to where it says HTTPS only. You see how it's on, switch it to off, and then you simply save the setting. And to do this for these 3 sites. So now we have the settings set up. Let's go ahead and let's create an application gateway. Put it on here. Create a new one. Okay, and we'll put it in East US. You don't need auto scaling right now. Okay, so an application gateway requires a public IP as stated before. And that public IP is basically used to identify it. So it's literally a public facing IP that anyone can access. So call it Okay. So this will order one for you, what have you. In the previous section, all really done is just select the network. Application gateways need to be in a subnet called application gateway. So just make sure that you have that. Everything else is pretty straightforward. We use standard V2. I don't think there's a difference in cost. So set up the front end. And then we go and we set up the back ends, right? So let's go ahead. So right now we can add a backend pool, and we haven't created a pool yet. So why don't we just finish, see if we can. Okay, so it'll create one for us. Okay. So we're in here, we're going to create a pool and we'll call it tutorials. So let's just call it pool tutorials. Okay. Okay, and so this pool tutorials is going to work with an app service, and the app service it works with is going to be just the tutorials app service. Click on add, adds it in there, and front end IP, it's going to use this new public IP. Backend IP is going to be this guy, and then as we discussed before, there's the rules, right? So the rules map one to the other, right? So we're going to create a new rule here. So rule tutorials, okay? And this rule we're going to give high priority, the lower the number, the higher priority. And let's give it a listener name. So we'll call it listener tutorials. And then as you can see, if you do HTTPS, you have to upload the certificate files. That's why we're going to do HTTP for this in this particular case. So it's going to be basic. Actually, let's make it multi-site. And let's make it basic. Then we go over to the back ends. And the back end here, so over here now, we've defined what the listener is. That's that front part. That's what receives it. If I do it, let's say multi-site, that I can actually enter in various site names or what have you. We don't have a site name right now. We're going to be doing it based on just the IP address. So that's why I'm just using basic, because there's not going to be any host name associated with it. So this is the listener part, right? We're working on the rule. Remember, the rule connects the listener to the actual backend, right? So now let's go to the backend targets, right? So we're using pool tutorials, and we're going to give it settings. Settings are basically HTTP based settings. So setting, right? So we're just saying that it's HTTPS, there's no cookie-based affinity. We're not overriding the host name. We'll get into that a little bit later. So we have our settings, we've got our tutorial pics, and then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to put in the paths, right? Unfortunately, you have to create one of these path-based routes to the portal as part of creating it. If you create it without adding any paths, then you have no ability as of right now to add those paths. So if you're planning to use paths, or even if you're just planning for the future, just add the paths. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to add our paths. So the first one is /tutorial1. And then we're going to use star to mean that if you match this, then we're good. And settings. And for now, we're going to just make it go here to the main tutorials. We're going to add those other ones later on. Let's give it a name. Okay. So that's one path. Then we'll also add the path for tutorial 2. Okay. And there's a setting, and we're going to also map it there. So now we have our 2 paths, right? So if anything comes in with /tutorial1, it'll go to this pool. If anything comes with /tutorial2, it'll go to this pool. If anything comes, just doesn't have any, it doesn't match any of these paths, then it'll use this as the default case and it'll match it to that. So that's basically how that's set up. And you can probably start to see now, like how this all works. So we'll go ahead and we'll wait for the gateway to be created. So while we're waiting, we can sort of see by looking at this chart what is going on and what we've just been talking about. You have these URLs that will be coming in based on how they come in. They would hit these listener layers up here, right? The listeners receive the message, and then rules are applied to the message coming in, right? So what is the host name? What's the path? One of them is what's the host name, right? That's that multi-site we saw. The other is what's the path, right? That's those path-based routes. Based on that, it will determine which one of these sites to go to based on, oh, well, actually one of these backend pools, right? So this is a pool right here. So let me label that as well. Okay. So each one of these will pick what pool to go to, and then within that pool, there will be some load balancing that happens, right? All right, so it looks like the gateway is done. So let's go ahead and let's go into it. So here it is, application gateway tutorials. And it's saying that my backends are not healthy. You can find out whether your backends are healthy by going to this health probe and seeing what's returning from them. As you can see here, these arrows point to the pools, the backend pools. So basically what I call here a pool, right, is actually what here is referred to backends. And right now there's really only one backend, which is this Momeka tutorials, port 80, and it's saying that it is not found. So believe it or not, this is actually to be expected. And this really has to do with the way Azure websites function. So let's take a look at an Azure website real quick. So we'll take our tutorials website that we're working on right now. And as you can see, if I click here, it's gonna open up this website address, right? But let's just see what this address actually is. So I'm gonna open up a telnet set, a Windows terminal session here, and I'm gonna use something called NS lookup to look up the IP address for a host name, right? So NS lookup, I just put in that host name, hit enter. And so what it's telling me the IP address is 20.119.136.5, right? So that's my IP address, right? Now I can actually go here, and if I wanted to see that to make sure that we're saying the same thing, just to show, you see here the same IP address that we saw here, 20.119.136.5. That's what my machine says the IP address for Momeka tutorials is. And if I go to Momeka tutorials, the app service in Azure, you can see that IP address is there as well, right? So that is the IP address associated with this. So let's go ahead and let's try to put that in and see if it works, right? And you can see it's going to say that it's not found, right? The reason it says that is because Azure websites require the actual host name to find them. You can't find them with the IP address. One IP address might be associated with multiple websites, and the way you distinguish one from another is by providing the actual host name. Now, in our application gateway, what we've done is we've set a backend pool. In this case, the backend pool is pointing to this this moment of tutorials, but the gateway itself, the address for the gateway is 20.7.183.4, right? 20.7.183.4. So when going back to my diagram, when I pass in 20 up here, I pass in the address, some IP address, right? When I pass in some IP address in here, right? If it's just a basic listener, right, which is that it'll just listen to anything, which is what I selected, then it's gonna just take whatever you listen to, and for that listener, it's gonna apply it to whatever the rule associated with that listener is. So in this case, the rule is just pass it all the way through, right? So as it passes it through, it's going to pass that IP address. So it's going to pass the IP address that you passed into me. That's what it's going to use to try to connect to it. And in this case, it's not even the right IP address, much less the host name, right? Because you're going to come in with that IP address, and that IP address does not exist. The IP address that exists locally is this one right here. And even if you pass this proper IP address in, you'd still end up with it not working, because as you can see, you can only pass the actual host name. So let's change that. So we change that by, if we go back to the rule that we specified, right? The rule was listening to this, which is just port 80. And the backend for it, the default backend is just my pool tutorial, right? And next to it, underneath it, we have this settings, right? Which you can apply on a per rule basis, right? To the backend pool, or even any individual paths, right? So let's go and let's look at these backend settings. So we have one in here, and the setting is just saying, hey, this is HTTP. We're not using cookies. There's no connection draining. Here's how long it takes. Here's how long it's going to take for the gateway will wait before it just responds back. If you take longer than this, in this case, if you take longer than 20 seconds, then the gateway will simply respond back and say that it failed, right? And then underneath that, you have this thing called hosts, right? And it says here, by default, application gateway does not change the incoming host header. In this case, the host header would be this 20.7, right? Incoming host header from the client, and sends the header unaltered to the backend, right? So for multi-tenant services like app service or API management that rely on a specific host header or SNI extension to resolve the correct endpoint, this will not work, right? So basically, they're letting you know that it's not going to work regular with app service. So to solve this problem, we basically just need to override the new host name. So it's going to be coming in with this IP address, and we're going to actually now change it to this host name, right? We're going to put that in there, and then we're going to save it. Just make sure that I don't want all that. So there, that's how we want it. Okay, so now that that's saved, we can now go back to this guy, right? So this will still not work, as you saw, but now we can go back to this guy. And as you can see, this was giving us a bad gateway before, but if we now refresh it, here we go, we have the site fully working, right? So what did we have to do? The first thing we had to do is we had to connect everything together. But then once we connected it together, we then had to basically set it up so that the back end would connect to the front end. So we did it this way. And right now I've entered the domain name there. If you want a shortcut and you don't want to enter the domain name, you just wanted to use what's already there, and you can click this thing and say pick host name from backend. So what it'll do here is it'll use the name of the backend that's associated with this rule that has this setting on it. It'll take that value and use it. So let's go ahead and let's save that. So we should now be able to save just, oops, we're over here, just do the same thing. And voila, you're done. Okay, so we've got it up and running. It's all working now. Everything is working great, but we do have one problem, right? We've got everybody accessing our site here. We want everybody to access our site here, and this is the entry point into our Blazor website or our site in general. But of course, people can still sort of circumvent that, and they can directly hit your website. And this is likely something that you don't want. So how do we stop that? Well, the easiest way to do that, and there's lots of ways, but the easiest way to do that is go right back to your website. And we're going to basically block traffic to your website and using a capability called access restrictions that your websites have. And we'll start with this tutorial, the tutorials page. So you just go down to networking. And you click on the access restrictions. And then you basically enable it and get it going by, you enable it and get it going by entering an item here. So right now, obviously, as you can see, the site is going normal. So we will now add a new rule. And the rule we want to add here is we want to add a rule, not just to prevent the outside world from accessing our app service, but really to prevent anybody except for our application gateway from accessing our app service. So go in here, we're going to select that, and we're going to say rule. Okay. So set up a gateway rule, and we're going to say that we allow this port. And that's basically it. It's a gateway rule that says that we're only going to allow this port. So we now have the rule in place, and then we can just go here and let's try it out. As you can see, that is now showing as forbidden. So basically, the site can now not be accessed. But if I go in here and I'm now going through the proper channels, the site loads absolutely fine. It's loading absolutely fine over here, and it's crashing over here. So you basically now have your full setup ready to go in terms of application gateway. Your application is now running as an Azure app service if you've been following along with the application gateway. For those who want to now get into the path-based routing, we'll now spend the rest of the lecture or lesson talking a little bit about that. Okay, so for further lessons on path-based routing, let's get right into it. So we'll go back to the application gateway. Actually, we'll first of all start with the app services, and we will do the same thing for each app service. Okay, so we are now officially all services blocked. None of them can be accessed. Tutorials 1. Tutorials 2, as you can see, none of them can be accessed anyway but through the gateway. So let's go back to the gateway now, and let's add some more listeners. I'm sorry, some more backends, right? So we had the one backend, which was just created to tutorial. Let's add some more backend pools. And this we will point to tutorial 1. We're now going to do tutorial 2. So now I'm going to load up tutorial 2. Okie. So now that's done. And now we go back to our trusty rules. And we previously had everything mapped to using the tutorials pool. We'll now change it. So this guy will now go to tutorial 1. So path tutorial / tutorial 1 will take you to tutorial 1, and / tutorial 2 will take you to tutorial 2. Okay. All right, now in principle, this should work, right? We're in here as we normally are. And if I click / tutorial 1, we're now getting, sorry, but there's nothing at this address. And if I do the same thing for / tutorial 2, nothing at this address. So what's happening here? So we can get a little bit to the bottom of what's happening by hitting F12 and opening up our trusty DevTools. And then let's refresh this page again when we are on the network tab. Okay. So you can see that it's going through and it's pulling some things out. Right. It's getting some things, and it's right now getting things from framework, right? But let's go here and let's look at what's happening in terms of like the rules that we've configured, right? So as we said, the basic way that path-based routing works is that it looks here when you enter your path, so it sees, is it tutorial 1? Is it tutorial 2? If it's not tutorial, if it's tutorial 1, then it'll use the tutorial 1 servers. If it's tutorial 2 / tutorial 2, then it'll use the tutorial 2 servers. If it's anything else, then it'll use just the tutorials servers, right? So if we go back here and we look at what's happening, some of these things in here, they're under this this thing called framework. And this is the problem with Blazor applications, right? I don't know how other libraries handle this, but this is the problem with Blazor applications, is that some of these folders are dynamically generated. They're static, right? So this stuff, anything that's inside a framework, and I think there's for the base one, there's a style sheet that also is tied to it. All those things are dynamically generated. And even though I'm in tutorials 2, it still puts it under framework. So this framework that it's reading is from tutorials. It's not from here, right? And so there's a little bit of a mismatch, right? So that mismatch that happens with Blazor applications is why you have to go and configure the last piece of this, which is URI or header rewrites, right? So you basically rewrite the URI, that the request that's actually going to go to your backend servers, to make it match what exactly you need it to match, right? And there's two things that we need to do for here. First thing we need to do is we need to find some way to uniquely identify the content that comes from each tutorial, right? So from tutorial 1, we want everything to be uniquely identified. From tutorial 2, we want everything to uniquely identified. So we can do that without changing anything by just going back to the websites, right? And in tutorial 1, we'll actually change the content. And Azure actually gives you a really cool tool. It's called the App Service Editor that you can go into. And then here you can actually edit your code. You can, if it's HTML, JavaScript, some basic things, you can edit it. Well, you can edit anything, but if it's something that needs to compile, then you have to have some kind of compiler. But you see in here, I'm now actually in the code of my application. Here's the code in my Blazor app. Here's your framework folder. Here's everything. So a fast way to get everything in your website to have a base URL associated with it when it doesn't have, when it's not starting with a /, which well, I'm not going to make any comments on that, but is to add it right here. So we'll add it to tutorials or tutorial 1. Okay, and then /. Make sure you add the /, right? So this automatically saves. And once it's saved, everything that's in that page that I'm going to go to tutorials 1 is going to come off of tutorial 1 like it was a folder, right? So let's go ahead and let's look at it. Okay, here we go. So now when I refresh it and I go to tutorial 1, you notice that all that gobbledygook that was coming before, none of that is there now. Well, why is that? Well, that's because if I look at my URIs now, they all have tutorial 1 in them. So this blazor.wasm file, WebAssembly, which I need to run when the page gets going, it can't run because if I go back to my code, you'll note that my framework is in the root, but I've now shifted my browsing. I've now shifted how the page is rendered one folder up. So it's expecting to find this blazor.webassembly.js. It's expecting to find it right in here, right? Blazor.webassembly.js. That's what it's looking for. But that's right under framework. There's no folder here called tutorial 1, which is what's actually showing up here. And it's the same for all these things. They're all underneath. They're all underneath the tutorial 1 folder. So how do we solve for this? Well, we solve for this with the third piece of the pie, which is the URI rewrites. So once you've now selected a backend pool that, once the request has selected by using the rules, a backend pool that it's going to be associated with. So go back here. I'm going to actually, before I do that, let me just go here and let me also modify the code for tutorial 2. So it says tutorial 2. And we just go here and we do the same thing. Tutorial to / it'll save by itself, perfecto, and that is done. I can close this as well. So now that that's done, we can now go here and just to test it out real quick, to see what happens. There we go. So tutorial 2 is also failing because it can't get past this tutorial 2 URL, right? So we solved this with URI rewrites, right? So if you remember, we go here and we look at these rules, right? What does the rule do? The rule is associated with a listener, and the rule selects based on the listener, right? And whatever paths you've specified here, it selects ultimately what backend pool you can pick. So that's the first thing that's going to do, is going to pick the backend pool. The next thing that happens, and it might not happen in this order, maybe it happens in the other order, but that's one other step that happens is that once it's picked the backend pool, there's an additional step before it sends the message to the actual server, to the pool. There's a step in between there where you can manipulate the message. You can manipulate the request, right? So you can change the request from what it was. So if I was going for, you know, hello.com/hi, you can change it to say hello.com/hola, right? And then that'll, if you know, and then that's what will go to the back end, right? So you can set it up that way. So the way you do that is using this thing called rewrites, right? And so how do rewrites work? So rewrites basically attach themselves to a rule, and as stated, for that specific rule, when that criteria occurs, it will rewrite the request, and then based on that rewrite, it'll do something. And the way that it determines what criteria is met is by basically using a regular expression. So it's pretty cool because you can be pretty verbose with how you want things to work and what you're trying to catch. And then you can also take some of the variables which will show you that you catch on one end and use them as values on the other end, right? So you're looking for this value, you capture this value, and then you use it on the other end as something else. So let's go ahead and let's look at some of the things that we need to pull out, right? So getting back to the issue. So one thing that needs to be pulled out looking here is that this Blazor Web Assembly, right? We know where framework is, so we need to get rid of tutorial when it's when it's framework, right? When we see that it's got this framework thing there, right? We need to get rid of the tutorial part. And then over here for the styles, it's the same thing. We need to take the styles and we basically need to bring it down, right? So, and then we need to do it just for that specific tutorial. So let's go in here and we'll create a new rule, rewrite. Okay, so this is for both of them. So these are the two paths that it's gonna be for. Okay, and it's not going to be for the main guy. The main guy we're just gonna leave alone. So let's go here, then we add a new rewrite, add a condition to it. So what's the first one? The first one is that we want this tutorial, right? We basically want to make it so that variable. So we need to select, you can use headers or you can use server variables that have been pulled out. So the server variable that there's a lot of things you can use, but the one that I'm interested in is URI path. That's the full path, right? And so when that path equals to this, right, this value, so when you're asking for tutorials, then I just want you to, after you've selected tutorial 2, I then want you to basically just remove this tutorial 2. It's going to pass the message onto the backend server for tutorial 2 without this tutorial 2 thing in there. So if you want to capture a variable, remember I talked about capturing variables. So we're going to use everything that comes after here, right? Whenever it's that, then over here, what we're going to do is, let me say okay to that. So that's how it's going to look there. So that's going to capture that. And it uses a weird nomenclature for how to read the variables out. Basically, it's made up of this path name. So it's var underscore, then the name of the server variable underscore, and then the number of times it's captured. So in this case, this is 1, right? So it's very strange, but you can read all about it. So we want to set the URI. So we're going to change the URI. We're going to give it a new path. And the path we're going to give it is var. To revoke a variable, you put it in curly brackets in var. Then the variable that we're looking at, and then the number of that variable, like how many of them were captured, the first one, the second one, the third one, right? So this is telling me essentially that any variable that comes in, any request that comes in with tutorial 2 / this, we're just going to turn into just that, right? So let's save this. We'll create it. Oh, good. Oh, need to give it a name. So we write tutorial. Okay. There we go. So that is now saved. And so let's go here. So when I refresh this now, I think we're on tutorial 1. Okay, so that should be fine. And the next thing we want to do is we want to add another rule. And this time it's a rule. So this is styles. This time it's a rule to move that framework stuff down, right? So we're gonna add a new rule. And so framework, and add a condition to it. So now this is essentially going to work the same as the previous one, but the only difference is that it's not just one file. It's going to be pretty much every file that's after framework, right? So we're going to put here, or after training, tutorial 1. And then the way to capture everything after that is dot star. That's going to take all that. And then same thing here. We're going to rewrite the URL. And we're going to just do framework. And then var URI path and 1. And up here, made a mistake. But with that, it's, yep, right. So basically what we're saying is that the URIs that come in with tutorial 1 / framework, right? Which again tutorial1/framework. That's what we're seeing here. The URIs that come in like that, we're going to remove it and make it just say framework, right? So we're going to save that. We're going to update this. We're now going to go back here, and now we've shifted it down so that if it says framework, there won't be this tutorial one. If it says any of these things, there won't be tutorial one, right? They will be just where they're supposed to be. So let's refresh this now. And look at that, we're getting some traction. And here we go. We now have the makings of what we're looking for, right? We have the actual application is actually working, interestingly enough. So the issues that we're having now have to do with the styles, right? So there are some styles that may not be showing up, right? So let's try to resolve that. So what we have to do now to resolve the styling is go back to our application and move things about a bit. So right now, those styles that we're looking for are located in the root of this folder. What we want them to do for static files is that we want them actually put into the folder, into a folder for that path, right? So that when the request goes to that backend pool, right, which again is going to happen based on the fact that in this case, we're coming in with tutorial one. So that's the first thing that hits. So when it hits tutorial one, it's going to go to the tutorial one backend pool. Now that we're in the tutorial one backend pool, right, we now need to find the URL we now need to remove tutorial one from this so that it basically just does the regular CSS, just the same way as we did with the other two. Now, we could do that. Another way to do it, I'm actually not going to show it, but I just want to go in here, is that you could also just take this right in here, add a folder called, let's say, tutorial one, and then basically just move all these files in there, right? So when you do that and you publish it, then those files will actually be there, right? So that's another approach to take. It's a little bit harder to do with the with the framework, because again, the framework is dynamically generated. So you don't actually, I mean, even though it's going to be generated where, it's always going to be generated at the root, but as you see, when you increase the base, or when you add a base URL to everything, it adds it to everything, but it doesn't affect that framework URL. That framework URL still gets created, not relative to that base, right? So another thing that we can do is just use the same kind of logic that we use with rewrites. So we have one that's doing tutorials and removing it, right? And this one is doing tutorials framework and removing it. So this one that's doing tutorials and removing it, we can actually just change that for star, right? So essentially we're just removing tutorials from everything. And then you actually wouldn't even need this, because it would just do it for everything. So we can actually just remove this, right? So this is just going to get rid of tutorials and then run everything normally on the page. Let's go here, let's refresh it. As you can see, once you hit refresh, you you now have the tutorial 1 page in it. So this page is fully running. And of course, the big problem is that when you go to tutorial 2, it now fails. So we now have to do essentially the same thing for tutorial 2, which is essentially just removing framework from the entire pipeline. And, because it's all the same, we can essentially do it all in one place. So styles tutorial 1, remove framework tutorial 1, and we're gonna call this one remove framework. Okay, so and this obviously has a condition, and the condition is essentially going to be the same thing. The URI path. The only difference is here, it's going to be tutorial 2. And the results will be essentially the same, right path, and we're just now having it be var URI path 1. Right. Let's change this. Just so we can know what we're talking about. Okay. So now we have tutorial 1. We've set it up for tutorial 2 as well. So over here now, if this is failing, it should work. Okay. So we're in tutorial 2. And so now the moment of truth, we can go here and start here. And we didn't actually add a label there, which kind of sucks, but I can go through, and I'm using my counter here. I can go here and I can do tutorial 1. That brings me in here. And I'm using this counter, fetching data, and I don't need this anymore. And then if I click tutorial 2, it's going to take me into tutorial 2, and tutorial 1 takes me to tutorial 1. So from the perspective of the user, it's all one site. It's the same host name. The parts of the application that I want to move quickly and be all stuck together, they move swiftly. The parts of the application that are other applications, I just redirect to them. And of course, that's going to cost me a page refresh. But once I'm done with that page refresh and that content is pulled down, I'm good to go and I can start working. So this has been a tutorial on Application Gateway. If you like this content, please subscribe. Keeps me motivated to keep teaching and, more importantly, learning. We'd love to hear from you. If you have any subject matters that you'd like to discuss, any technical issues you'd like to hash out, and maybe even be interviewed and talk about to help our community grow. Obviously, get involved, let me know, send me a message. But until my next videos, have a blessed day.